shatter your belief that cardio is the way forward if you want to lose fat. Everybody seems to be doing some form of cardio, or everybody's knee-jerk reactions to do cardio in order to lose fat. And what I want to explain today is something called the fat loss pyramid. I'm going to go through each and every section and absolutely shatter your belief that cardio is the way forward if you want to lose fat. Today is going to be a bit more educational than it is ranty on my behalf. I'm sure there will be the odd rant though, don't worry. But ultimately, I want to talk you through this fat loss pyramid and talk about the importance of these different layers and the hierarchy of them within the pursuit of fat loss specifically. So why ultimately do we use a pyramid for this? Well, because not all things in fat loss contribute equally. And in this, we're actually doing an inverted pyramid. So the very top of the pyramid is the most important, and then we filter down to the least important contributing factor to fat loss. So we'll start with layer one, the most important layer when it comes to fat loss. And you'll have heard it all before, and I'm sorry to bore you, but calorie deficit. Without being in a calorie deficit, literally nothing else matters. You could be, I don't know, training 7 times a week and running a marathon every other day and still not lose fat if the calorie deficit isn't in place. So fat loss and fat burn are two very different things. Will you burn fat? Absolutely. But if you're not eating in a deficit, you won't lose any fat. And what does a calorie deficit mean? So to break it down into the most simplest term, you need to eat less energy than you use. Because if you use more energy than is available through food, then the body will use fat as fuel. Now, fat isn't always the most efficient fuel, but in the absence of any fuel, that's what it's going to take. And especially if you're in something like a steady state cardio, i.e. moving, walking, that's an ideal environment for fat to be used as fuel. However, that still blurs that line between fat loss and fat burn. So fat loss will only happen if the energy you consume through food and drink is less than the calories you expend or use throughout the day. An important element of this, however, is just how aggressive you take this deficit. And for me, knowing that I harp on about sustainability and wanting to make sure that any approach you take has got some longevity to it, then somewhere around 300 to 500 calories less than your maintenance level is a good starting place and a consistent deficit to be in to have continued fat loss. Can you go more aggressive? Absolutely. Will you be able to stick at it? Absolutely not. So picking your maintenance level and then going down by 300 to 500 calories is going to give you a good starting point for the deficit you need to be in. If you're not sure how to work all of this out, if you head to my website, ada-pt.com, there's a calorie counter on there, a calorie calculator on there, so you can go and have a look, punch in your details, and it'll give you a good idea of where you need to be aiming. That was a little plug. Yay. Second most important thing whilst in a fat loss journey is your protein. Your protein intake is paramount. So we know that we need to be in a caloric deficit in order to lose fat. Protein, however, ensures that the weight that you lose, not the fat, but the weight that you lose doesn't come from muscle mass. So ensuring that you have an adequate protein intake whilst in your deficit will help to potentially reduce, if there is any in the first place, any muscle loss during the process. It's also the number one macronutrient for keeping you full, so it takes the longest to digest. Excellent. So you get a feeling of fullness, satiation. put my teeth in for that one. So you remain satiated for longer because protein takes the longest to digest. Also, the number of calories burnt through the digestion process, your TEF, thermic effect of food, the amount of calories you burn in that digestion is much higher. So actually the number of calories you absorb from protein is a lot less. So you can save calories by eating more protein because 30% of the calories on average that you consume as a protein source are used in the digestion process of that. So not only does it keep you fuller for longer and stop muscle loss wastage, it's also going to be more efficient for your calories because it burns more calories digesting it. Excellent news. So protein, please make sure you have it. Before we go on to the next layer of this pyramid, I want to explain briefly, but I'm going to do a full video about this next week, about the caloric burn element of being in a fat loss phase. Because everybody seems to think that exercise is the be all or end all when it comes to burning calories. And actually, structured exercise only accounts for 5% on average of your total caloric burn throughout the day. The biggest influencer or the biggest burner of calories is something called your BMR, your basal metabolic rate. In other words, how many calories you burn at rest. I think mine's around 1850 is my BMR. But that's how many calories you just burn surviving, being alive, heart, lung, brain, all the functions that keep you alive. That's your basal metabolic rate. So that's the biggest contributor to your total caloric burn. The second biggest contributor to your total caloric burn is your NEAT, your non-exercise activity thermogenesis. In other words, fidgeting, sitting up, standing up, sitting down, picking your nose, movement, your day-to-day mundane movements. So I may well be quite animated sometimes when I'm talking. All of that requires energy. So your NEAT, your non-exercise activity thermogenesis, is the second biggest contributor to your total caloric burn throughout a day. Included within that is also just walking around, getting your steps in. That's why we harp on about making sure you're moving enough throughout the normal day. Because structured exercise is so low on the list, we need to make sure that throughout the day, we are increasing our NEAT and adding to its already powerful place in your total caloric burn. Then we have TEF, which I briefly mentioned from your protein. So TEF is the thermic effect of food. In other words, how much energy is required to digest the food that you eat. We know that proteins use the most amount of calories, up to around 30%. Carbohydrates is nearer 10% and fats is anywhere between 0 and 5%. So the total amount of calories consumed digesting the food that you eat is the third biggest contributor to your total caloric burn. And then last on the list is your EAT, your exercise activity thermogenesis. So your strength training, your cardio, your aerobics, HIIT, high rocks, whatever it is, all of that only accounts for around 5% of your total caloric burn. So when you look at it that way, you can see that there are far more important areas to consider when thinking about caloric burn than specifically just focusing on structured exercise. So daily movement's the big one. And we'll come back to the whole BMR thing and muscle mass and the implications of having more muscle and increasing your metabolism in your BMR in the other video. So keep an eye out for that one next week. Back to the pyramid. We're now at the third step of the pyramid, and we're now talking about weights, resistance training. Now, it's worth clarifying here that doing strength training, resistance training, lifting weights isn't on the list because of the amount of calories you burn during a session. Because if it's relative to a cardio session, you will burn more calories in a 45-minute cardio session than you will in a strength session, generally. However, the amount of calories your body burns post-workout from strength training remains elevated for longer, because ultimately what you're doing in any form of strength training, even if you lift up a shopping bag that's a little too heavy, is you're tearing fibers of your muscle. Your body then repairs those fibers, and that's how muscles become stronger. That process requires calories though, energy. So that afterburn effect actually lasts much longer than post cardio session, as the body has a raised metabolism, repairing ultimately the damage that you've done to it. And this can be raised for up to 48 hours. But certainly for the first 10 to 12 hours, your metabolism has increased, repairing damage, and also making sure you're giving it the fuel it needs, i.e. the proteins, to help with that repair process. The other advantage of weight training is also the increase in lean muscle mass. Now then, the more lean muscle mass you have, the more calories you burn at rest. So your BMR, your basal metabolic rate, increases the more muscle you have on your skeletal frame. And because muscle is more metabolically active and it raises your BMR, the calorie deficit that you need to be in order to lose fat is slightly higher. Excellent news. So basically you get to eat more, the more muscle you've got, and still be in a deficit. So it's a win-win. Number 4 on the pyramid is sleep, an often overlooked element of fat loss, but one that I insist with my clients is brought to the forefront, and it is an incredibly powerful tool in your fat loss. And here's why. So if you're not consistently getting more than 6 to 7 hours sleep a night, ideally 8 to 9 is the sort of the perfect window, what can happen is a hunger hormone called ghrelin accelerates. So ultimately you feel hungry all the time because this hormone ghrelin is increased. So the hunger hormone is going, right, you haven't eaten enough, we need more energy. So you're always going to feel more hungry. So the more sleep you have, the less ghrelin you produce, and thus curbing any feelings of hunger. So get rid of the ghrelin, make sure you're sleeping enough. The second hormone is something called leptin, and leptin is the one that tells your body you're full, or tells your brain that you're full. And this decreases if we don't have enough sleep. So your hunger hormone increases and your fullness hormone decreases. So it's basically a perfect storm for eating more food than you otherwise would need if you'd had adequate sleep. Sleep is also really powerful because it's the opportunity for your body to repair and recover from the day, the training session, the cardio session, the long walk, the stress, just the damage that happens to your body throughout a normal day. You then need to give your body the adequate rest so it can recover and repair. If it doesn't get that opportunity to recover and repair, it's going to be constantly in this kind of fight or flight state. So the loss or use of fat as a fuel then becomes more difficult for the body as it just retains everything. And then ultimately, the training intensity will reduce because your body hasn't fully recovered. It becomes this perpetual vicious cycle of training but under intensity, not recovering properly because you haven't had the adequate sleep, which then encourages more production of ghrelin and a reduction in leptin, which then means your muscles aren't ready to be fired again because you've been eating shit. And then you try and go into your next training session, you haven't then recovered properly, so the intensity in which you can train reduces, and it just continues in this cycle. And that progressive overload that we look for when we're training just gets further and further and further away because we haven't had that time to recover. So sleep, please, the more the better. On a side note, I'm usually in bed by 8:30. It doesn't mean I go to sleep at 8:30, but it means that that's the start of my bedtime routine. There's no phones, no TVs, no blue lights, no distractions. I'll go up, I'll brush my teeth, I'll have a shower, I'll read my book, and I'd like to be asleep by around 10 o'clock latest, because if I'm up at 6 o'clock, 10 till 6 is my 8 hours. So I always count back from the time I need to be up to work out what time I need to be asleep. And I know that that process will generally take around an hour to an hour and a half. So that's why I'm upstairs by 8:30, and that's the start of my bedtime routine. Yes, I know, incredibly boring, but it works because I really do prioritize my sleep. And lastly, we've got number 5, cardio. So the final layer of this pyramid is cardio activity. And before any cardio bunnies want to rage bait me, cardio plays an essential role in your overall health, for your mental health, your physical health, but specifically cardiovascular health. So please do not think that cardio is bad or that cardio isn't important, because it is massively, and I play a lot of squash. That's my cardio, although currently, because of my back situation, I'm not playing, and that's impacting me physically, emotionally, and mentally. But I digress. So I'm not demonizing cardio. I am saying cardio absolutely plays a role in your overall health and well-being. However, when it comes specifically to fat loss, it is the least important element. Will you burn more calories doing 45 minutes of cardio over strength training? Absolutely. But as I've already discussed, strength training has numerous other benefits, which is that increase in your metabolism for a longer period of time. The more muscle mass you have, the more calories you burn at rest, thusly increasing your basal metabolic rate. And it's also going to help with your joint stability, joint structure, posture, and it's going to help prevent the inevitable age-related muscle and bone mass wastage as we get later in life. So that is why strength training is above cardio, and cardio has all of its own merits. But stop focusing on cardio in order to lose fat specifically, because the other 4 steps prior to that play a much more integral role in your total fat loss journey. There's also a well-documented phenomenon which relates to increase in food consumption post-cardio, and also is related to reduced daily activity post-cardio. So you eat more and you move less having done some cardio, thusly decreasing your total NEAT across the entirety of the day, your non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So now, what was one of the bigger contributors has now been negatively impacted by the cardio. And it's also worth noting that the actual calories burnt through cardio are often overestimated through our smartwatches and heart rate monitors, and actually the number is a lot less than we assume it to be. So take everything you assume you burn through a cardio session with a literal pinch of salt and a figurative one. Ultimately, what I'm trying to say is, don't build your fat loss plan around cardio. Build it around all the other stuff, and do cardio because you enjoy it, because you feel better for having done it, and because it will improve your cardiovascular health. But don't do it if you fucking hate it, under the belief that you need to do it in order to lose fat. So there it is, the fat loss pyramid. Calorie deficit at the top, protein intake next, Lifting weights or any kind of strength or resistance training, 3. Sleep, number 4. And last on the list is your cardio. So I hope that clears some things up and justifies through my explanation why the pyramid is in that order. Most people have this the wrong way around, and that's why I thought it's worth putting this together as a video to hopefully help clarify the order in which, or the order of importance, these different elements hold in your fat loss journey. Killing themselves doing cardio, skipping the weights and doing 5 hours sleep. So let's flip it on its head. Let's focus on everything in that order. Try not to do everything overnight, because that's just going to risk ultimate burnout. Rein yourself in, slow down, get everything right, and just slowly build on it. That's everything from me this week. I hope you've got some value out of it. Hit the subscribe wherever it is. Tell all your friends. And next week I'll be talking specifically about caloric burn and delving a little bit deeper into things like your TDEE, your total daily energy expenditure, and what that's made up of in a little bit more detail. Speak soon.